June 4, 1942 had ended Japan's hope of winning the Pacific War in an afternoon. The following spring, over the English Channel and the coast of occupied France, a different kind of reckoning was quietly unfolding, not between fleets, but between a strategic doctrine and the men it was consuming. The doctrine said the B-17 Flying Fortress could survive over Europe in daylight without fighter escort. The men flying the missions were accumulating evidence that said otherwise. On the morning of May 1, 1943, a 31-year-old staff sergeant from Michigan named Maynard Harrison Smith climbed into the tail gun position of a B-17 named Bad Check at Thilly Aerodrome in Bedfordshire, England. It was his first combat mission. He had never wanted to be in the war. He had tried, by every legal means available to him, to avoid it. None of those means had worked. Within 4 hours, he would perform one of the most remarkable acts of individual improvisation in the history of American air warfare. Within 2 months, he would receive the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted man in the 8th Air Force to do so. And within the year, he would be facing disciplinary proceedings. This is the story of those 90 minutes over the Atlantic, and what they revealed about the war being fought above the clouds. If you're new here, this channel tells the human stories that get lost inside the larger history. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. To understand what happened on May 1st, you have to understand what the 8th Air Force believed it was doing in the spring of 1943, and why that belief was already showing cracks. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany rested on a doctrine developed largely in peacetime at the United States Army Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama. The doctrine held that precision daylight bombing of industrial targets, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail junctions, could strangle the German war machine without the mass infantry slaughter of the First World War's Western Front. It was a genuinely compelling idea, and it depended critically on one assumption: that the B-17 could survive over Germany without fighter escort. The B-17G model carried 1350 caliber machine guns arranged to cover nearly every angle of approach. The theory was that formations flying in tight combat boxes could concentrate their defensive fire into an impenetrable wall of lead. Luftwaffe pilots would be deterred. Losses would be manageable. The targets would be destroyed. By the spring of 1943, the mission logs were telling a different story. On April 17th, 85 B-17s attacked the Focke-Wulf factory at Bremen. 16 aircraft were lost, nearly 19% of the force. A loss rate that, sustained over time, would eliminate an entire bomb group in fewer than 6 missions. The crews doing the mathematics in the Nissen huts at night, counting empty bunks, watching which aircraft did not return from the hard standings, were arriving at conclusions the doctrine had not accounted for. The tail gun position that Smith occupied held a specific and well-understood reputation among those crews. The geometry of fighter attacks meant the tail gunner engaged enemy aircraft more frequently, and at closer range than almost any other crew position. The Focke-Wulf 190, in the hands of an experienced Luftwaffe pilot, could approach from the rear, hold fire until nearly inside the formation, then walk cannon shells down the fuselage before breaking away faster than most defensive guns could track. The tail gunner was the last man between that approach and the rest of the crew. He was also, by the structure of the aircraft, isolated from them, separated by the length of the bomb bay and the waist gun compartment, the most distant position from the forward escape hatches. The men assigned to tail gun positions knew what the statistics suggested. Most of them had made the same calculation the rest of the crew made and arrived at the same conclusion: that the calculation, while real, could not be allowed to govern behavior. You did the job. The alternative was something the social and military pressure of the situation made nearly impossible. Maynard Smith was not the obvious man for that position. He had been born in Cairo, Michigan in 1911, making him 31, old for a combat airman, old enough to have lived a full and somewhat turbulent civilian life before the draft found him in February 1942. He had worked various jobs. He had a failed marriage. People who knew him described a man who preferred his own schedule and his own comfort to institutional demands. His training record suggested someone who met standards when required and rarely exceeded them. He had been assigned to the 423rd Bomb Squadron of the 306th Bomb Group at Thilly. On May 1st, he was slotted into Bad Check as a replacement for the regular tail gunner, who was unavailable. This was his first mission. He had no history with this crew, No shared language built over previous flights. He was, in the precise military sense, a stranger. The formation lifted off from Thalie in the early morning and assembled over the North Sea before turning toward France. The target was the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the Loire estuary. Reinforced concrete structures built specifically to survive aerial attack, defended by flak batteries the crews knew with unpleasant familiarity. Over Saint-Nazaire, the flak was heavy. The formation released its bombs and turned for England. That was when the Focke-Wulf 190s found them. The attack came from the rear. 2 fighters made it through the formation's defensive fire. The first cannon burst struck bad check aft of the waist gun positions. Aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, the aft section of the fuselage was burning. The second pass struck the radio compartment. The interphone, the internal communication system connecting the crew through their oxygen masks, went silent. Smith, in the tail, could no longer hear the pilot. He could not hear the bombardier or the navigator or anyone in the forward sections of the aircraft. He did not know if a bailout order had been given. He did not know if anyone forward was still alive. What he could hear was the fire. He had several rational options. He could clip on his parachute and exit through the tail hatch. The aircraft was over occupied France, and his chances on the ground were not good. But the aircraft was burning, and fire was how most men died in B-17s. He could freeze, which was not cowardice but physiological reality for men in that position. What Smith did instead resists easy explanation. He crawled forward out of the tail position into the burning fuselage. He found the 2 waist gunners. One had been wounded by cannon fragments. The other had already bailed out and would spend the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. Smith dragged the wounded man, Robert Folliard, away from the flames. He found a walk-around oxygen bottle, a small portable unit providing perhaps 8 minutes of breathing supply at altitude, and connected it to Folliard's mask. Then he went back to fight the fire, using the carbon dioxide extinguisher mounted in the compartment, and when that was exhausted, his flight jacket and his bare hands, Smith fought the fire in the aft fuselage while simultaneously returning to the tail gun position to engage the German fighters still pursuing the formation. This went on for approximately 90 minutes. The numbers deserve a moment's consideration. A walk-around oxygen bottle provided 8 minutes of supply. Smith was working at 27,000 feet, where the atmosphere cannot sustain consciousness without supplemental oxygen. He was moving continuously between the tail gun and the fire, managing his oxygen connection with each movement, each period at the gun cutting into his breathing supply, each period fighting the fire taxing it further. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, begins affecting cognitive function within minutes at that altitude. Its symptoms are insidious. A false sense of calm, subtly impaired judgment. Men who lost their oxygen connections at altitude sometimes simply did not register that they were losing the ability to respond to their situation. Smith registered it. He managed his supply with a pragmatic discipline that the conditions made remarkable. The hand burns he sustained were not minor. Medical records describe second-degree burns across both palms, the result of direct contact with burning material when the extinguisher ran out and the flight jacket was no longer enough. This was not metaphor. It was a physiological event with documented consequences. Meanwhile, the Focke-Wulfs continued making passes at the struggling formation. Bad check, trailing smoke was a visible target. Smith returned to the ring site, fired in bursts, cleared at least one jam, and continued. At some point during the return flight, his fire drove off 2 of the attacking fighters. Whether either was destroyed or merely discouraged, the records do not say with certainty. Smith himself was not a man who inflated his claims. The pilot, Lieutenant Lewis Johnson, held the aircraft in formation and flew toward England. He knew the aircraft was damaged. He could see the smoke from the cockpit. He could not raise the aft section on the interphone. He made the judgment that a controlled landing offered better survival odds than bailout over cold water, where hypothermia could kill a man in minutes. Over the English coast, he began his descent. The hydraulic system had been damaged, so the landing gear had to be hand-cranked down. The brakes were unreliable. Johnson brought bad check-in on a straight approach to Predanach Aerodrome in Cornwall and put it on the ground. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Smith climbed out through the tail hatch. His hands were burned. His flight jacket was scorched. He had been managing oxygen bottles for the better part of 90 minutes at altitude, and his body was registering the physiological cost. Ground personnel who met the aircraft found him sitting near the tail, still in his flight gear, eating a can of rations he had apparently retrieved from somewhere inside the aircraft. Robert Folliard was alive. The rest of the crew was alive. Bad check had not killed anyone. The official recognition came quickly. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, personally pinned the Medal of Honor on Maynard Smith on July 4, 1943, Independence Day, a date not chosen by accident. Reporters were invited. Photographers recorded it. Eaker understood that the ceremony needed to communicate something to the thousands of young men in his command who were flying missions with loss rates that had begun to strain the human capacity to absorb them. The inspirational version of Smith's story, the one the ceremony was designed to project, was accurate as far as it went. What he had done was extraordinary. The medal was earned. But the story the ceremony told was simpler than the reality behind it, in ways that the summer and fall of 1943 would make impossible to ignore. The fundamental problem the 8th Air Force faced had not changed between May 1st and the 4th of July. The problem was range. Until there were fighters that could accompany the bombers to the target and back, the B-17s were flying unprotected for the most dangerous portions of their missions. The targets that mattered most, the oil facilities, the aircraft factories, the ball bearing plants, were deep inside German-controlled airspace, beyond any escort range available in 1943. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach the German border and no further. The P-51 Mustang, which would eventually change the calculation entirely, was not yet operational in the numbers required. The crews flying those missions understood this. They attended briefings where the red string on the planning map stretched deep into Germany and the route card showed hours of unescorted flight over territory where the Luftwaffe could concentrate everything it had. They flew anyway, not because they were unafraid, the historical record on this point is unambiguous, but because training, unit cohesion, genuine belief in the mission's importance, and the particular social pressure of military life made not flying the harder choice. This is what makes Maynard Smith's story more than a straightforward account of courage. He had entered the war reluctantly, had not distinguished himself in training, had been placed as a replacement in a position he had never previously occupied on a crew he did not know. And in that position, when the worst case arrived, he had responded with 90 minutes of sustained, effective, improvised action that no doctrine had specifically prepared him for. The Army made a medal ceremony of it because medal ceremonies serve institutional purposes. But what Smith had actually demonstrated was something the institution could not quite contain in its citation language: that the gap between a man's history and his capacity, under the right or wrong conditions, can be vast and unpredictable in both directions. The reckoning the 8th Air Force had been postponing arrived on October 14, 1943. 291 B-17s turned east toward Schweinfurt, Germany, and the ball-bearing plants that a previous mission in August had damaged but not destroyed. The August mission had cost 60 aircraft and 600 men. The October mission cost 60 aircraft and 592 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. More than 26% of the attacking force, gone in one day. It became known as Black Thursday. After it, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions into Germany. The doctrine, as executed without long-range escort, had met the reality, and the reality had won. The men who had flown through the summer, who had survived May 1st and the missions before and after it, received this suspension with a mixture of relief and something harder to articulate. Relief because the losses had been unsustainable and they had known it, and something harder because the suspension implicitly acknowledged what they had been living for months: that the strategy, as executed, had been asking more than the evidence suggested it could justify. Across the 8th Air Force, the accounting was severe. More than 26,000 men killed in action over the course of the war. More than 4,000 heavy bombers lost. Numbers that exist at a scale which resists personal comprehension until you reduce them to their components. The empty bunk, the personal effects box for shipment home, the name on the casualty list that had been a name on a crew manifest the week before. The correction came in early 1944, when General Jimmy Doolittle replaced Eaker in command and the P-51 Mustang arrived in sufficient numbers to escort the bombers to the deepest targets and back. Doolittle unleashed the Mustang escorts with different orders, not to stay close to the bombers, but to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. German fighter pilot losses in those air battles were severe, and production could not replace experienced pilots at the rate the fighting consumed them. The attrition that had been running against the 8th Air Force through 1943 began to run the other direction. The oil campaign of 1944, targeting synthetic fuel facilities, proved more effective than the ball-bearing campaign of the previous year. German aircraft sat on airfields unable to fly for lack of fuel. German armored units ran dry on the road. The connection between the bombers at altitude and the outcome of the land war was real, though it was messier and more contingent than the pre-war doctrine had imagined, and it had been established at a price the doctrine had not fully accounted for. The men who paid that price in 1942 and 1943, before the escorts arrived, before the tactics matured, returned to America in 1945 to a country that celebrated them with a broad, general gratitude that could not quite reach the specific things they had experienced. The country knew about the 8th Air Force. It had read the dispatches and seen the newsreels. What it could not know was what it had felt like in the tail position at 27,000 feet with the fuselage on fire and the interphone dead and the German fighters still making passes and the oxygen running low. Smith knew. Folliard knew. Johnson knew. The crew of Bad Check knew in the way that only people who have shared a specific extreme experience can know it, through a shared reference point that requires no explanation between them because it is the explanation. Maynard Smith did not return seamlessly to the institutional life of the Army Air Forces after the medal ceremony. He accumulated disciplinary entries. He was reduced in rank. He was moved between assignments. The Army processed him the way institutions process difficult men, with administrative patience and procedural friction, neither dismissing him nor accommodating who he actually was. He flew additional missions. He was never again in a burning aircraft alone in the aft section with a dead interphone and German fighters making passes for 90 minutes. That specific configuration of catastrophe had been his singular, and he had survived it. He was discharged in 1945 and returned to Michigan. He worked various jobs in the post-war years, none of them particularly notable, none of them requiring 90 minutes of sustained improvised action in a burning aircraft at altitude. He died in Florida in 1984, at 72 years old. His obituaries noted the Medal of Honor. They noted the mission. They noted that he had been the first enlisted man in the 8th Air Force to receive the decoration. What they could not fully capture was the specific quality of what had happened on that aircraft. The fire and the oxygen and the ring sight and the wounded man and the interphone silence and the hands pressed against burning material because the extinguisher was empty and there was nothing else. Robert Folliard recovered from his wounds and eventually returned to flight status. He survived the war. What he made of the fact that a replacement tail gunner on his first mission had kept him alive through the return flight is not recorded in any surviving document. But he knew it. He carried that knowledge in whatever form such knowledge takes in a man who has been kept alive by another man's action. Lieutenant Johnson brought Bad Check home because he made a series of correct judgments under conditions of extreme stress, holding the formation, managing the damaged aircraft, choosing landing over bailout when the mathematics of the situation made landing the better option. He did not know, for most of that return flight, whether anyone in the aft section was alive. He held the aircraft together anyway. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were bombed again in February 1944, this time with Mustang escort. The losses were lower and the results were better. German ball-bearing production was disrupted, though German industry proved more adaptable than pre-war analysis had assumed, dispersing production, drawing on stockpiles, finding substitutes. The campaign was effective without being the decisive blow its architects had predicted. The men who had flown to Schweinfurt in October 1943 without escort had contributed to a process their successors completed under better conditions. History distributed the credit across the entire campaign while concentrating the cost in its earliest and most expensive phase. This is the arithmetic of strategic air warfare, and it does not balance neatly when applied at the level of individual human lives. What Maynard Smith's story ultimately tells us is not quite what the 4th of July medal ceremony was designed to communicate. It is not a clean story of hidden heroism unlocked by crisis, though that element is present and real. It is a story about the specific, unrepeatable intersection of a particular man and a particular situation, About what 90 minutes connected a complicated, avoidance-prone man from Michigan with a burning aircraft over the Atlantic and produced something neither his history nor the doctrine had prepared anyone to predict. It is also a story about the gap between strategy and experience. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign was a genuine strategic achievement, viewed from sufficient distance. Viewed from the tail gun position with a dead interphone and fire in the fuselage, it was something else simultaneously, an experience of extreme physiological stress, of isolation, of improvised response to conditions no training had fully modeled. Both of these things were true at the same time, and understanding the full reality of the campaign requires holding both without allowing either to cancel the other. The B-17 named Bad Check was eventually taken to a depot for major repair. Whether it flew again under that name or was stripped and its components distributed across other aircraft is not recorded with certainty. Aircraft in the 8th Air Force had a way of becoming anonymous through the accumulation of repairs and replacements, the original machine persisting more in the records than in the metal. The tail gun position had been occupied by different men before Smith. Men who had survived. Men who had not. Smith had occupied it for one mission and had not gone back to it aboard that aircraft. His subsequent assignments moved him through the administrative machinery of the 8th Air Force in ways the disciplinary record reflects and the operational record somewhat obscures. In the end, what mattered most was not the doctrine or the strategy or the medal ceremony. It was the aircraft on the ground at Predanak and the men climbing out of it, alive into the English morning. In the 8th Air Force, in the spring of 1943, that was not something you could plan for with certainty. It was not something you could take for granted. It was the thing that mattered most, and on May 1st, it happened. If the story changed how you see the air war over Europe, share it with someone who thinks they already know that history. They may know the strategy. They may not know what it looked like from the tail. And if you want more stories like this one, you know where to find them.